Here we go again. I had quite a few requests to have a look at the Ruger Model 77, one of my favorite rifles. I've owned a few of them. And in particular, viewer Patrick Meager, Patrick, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. You had a bunch of good questions and comments on the Ruger 77. So here we go, and what I'm going to do is show the difference between the Ruger 77. This is a Hawkeye model. It's the most recent model. I bought it from Lipsy's or somebody. There was a special run in 35 Whelen, or Whelan, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And so I picked up one. But what I have to say applies to the Ruger 77, and then I've got a Ruger American on the table in 450 Bushmaster, which is kind of a cool round. I actually had it at the range the other day and I wanted to film for you, but it didn't work out. Anyhow, here's the Ruger 77, and probably most people recognize this. I mean, it's an extremely successful rifle. It's disassembled for you here, so you can see what it looks like. So I'll just go step by step. Ruger 77, it's got a decent walnut stock. Proportions are about right. It's got some kind of a recoil pad. Maybe it's better to say a rubber butt plate. It's got some sling swivels. The inletting is, I mean, it is what it is. It's fine. It's good. It's not glass bedded. The fit and finish are good. It's got a grip cap with the Ruger logo. So that's the stock Ruger 77 Hawkeye. Here's the Ruger American, some kind of polymer, and it's not bad. The proportions are fine. It has some kind of pressed in or glued in recoil pad. It also has sling swivels front and back. It also has kind of a plastic grip cap with the Ruger logo. Obviously this has a removable magazine. The Model 77 has a floor plate, and in the stock that's where the floor plate goes. Quite simple. I should draw to your attention, this is the Recoil Lug. This is where the action sits, and recoil has to be absorbed in this area. The action has a recoil lug here, so when you fire the gun, the pressure is absorbed in this area of the stock, so it has to be strong. The Ruger American, like the Tikka T3 and a lot of guns these days, the action is a tubular action. There's no recoil lug on the action, as you can see. Instead, there are these mortises. Now the Ruger American has 4 of them, 2 and 2, and those mortises correspond to these aluminum V blocks, which are molded into the synthetic stock. So what can I say? The modern gun game is to accomplish accuracy and the same results, roughly speaking, that shooters are expecting, but using entirely different materials. Now when I say entirely different, I mean instead of a wood stock, it's a polymer stock. A wood stock has to be fitted, it has to be finished, it has to be sanded, then the rubber butt plate has to be fitted, sanded, finished, and so on. This is probably produced by a machine, and well, it is, and I don't think anybody handles these things, and some machine puts in these swivel studs. These V blocks work, so it kind of looks like a bolt action rifle, and it handles like a bolt action rifle, and it is a bolt action rifle, but it's entirely different. On the Ruger 77 you have a steel assembly with a mechanism and a release spring and lever for the floor plate. On the Ruger American, the trigger guard is part of the synthetic stock, and the magazine on the American is also synthetic. I guess what I'm trying to say is this gun works, and it works well, and it's very accurate from my experience on the range the other day. But this is an entirely different creature from the Ruger 77, and these change hands, I don't know, $300, $400, $500. It's hard to keep track of the pricing actually. This is the Ruger American Bolt, and you'll notice a trend these days. I think everybody's doing this. The Seiko 85, the Coopers, they all are going to 3 locking lugs. Partly it's so that the bolt lift is reduced, which is accomplished by the 3 lugs. I don't know. I think 2 lugs lock bolts quite well for a long time. The Ruger 77 bolt, I mean, it looks a lot like a Mauser bolt. We've talked about those probably too many times. It's similar. It's kind of a hybrid of a controlled round feed, but you can put a cartridge directly in the chamber of a 77. This will jump the rimless cartridge case and feed. And of course, on the Ruger American, you've got a typical, people sometimes call these Seiko style extractors, and then the ejector is in the bolt face, which we've seen on Remington 700s for a long time. The bolt handle is, it goes right through the bolt, and it may be retained by a pin or a screw. Some are press fit. It's a separate piece from the bolt. And on the 77, these are investment cast, so these are kind of unique. On Mausers, it was a one-piece forging and didn't break off. And on the 77, I've never heard of these coming off. And investment casting is a very strong piece of steel. I think there are casting companies like Pine Tree Castings or something like that. And actually, I know a lot about that facility. But anyway, that's the Ruger 77 bolt. Then there's the American bolt. And it's a cool cartridge, by the way, the 450 Bushmaster. This has this integral Picatinny rail. I think it's screwed on at the factory. Just 4 typical, looks like Torx screws. Maybe a good idea. And then the Ruger 77, which is around, I don't know, $1,000, somewhere in there. It has the old dovetail system, which again, these aren't milled in. That would be expensive to do. Can be done though. This whole action is an investment casting. By that I mean the action is basically made out of wax first, and then it's embedded in clay. This looks like rust, but it's just sawdust. It's embedded in a special clay, and I'm really simplifying investment casting, and then molten steel is poured into the into this clay housing. It's called the lost wax process. It's been around for a long time. You could have a look. It's quite interesting. Anyhow, then the barrel's threaded in, and as I've told you before, headspace is crucial to accuracy and safety. So on this Ruger 77, it's traditional threading, thread into the action under pressure with a proper vise and so forth. The American looks like they have a simplified some kind of a shoulder and collar system like the Savage and a few other rifles they use. It's an easier way, it's hard to describe exactly. It's an easier way of accomplishing headspace, proper headspace, and it works. So, I mean, you can see even just looking at the components, the American has one stock with the V-blocks, the recoil pads part of the stock more or less, the trigger guard is, and then you have a bolt, and then you have an action. The action is very simple. This is really sort of steel feedstock, trigger in a typical aluminum housing, and the trigger I think is good. People make a big deal about triggers, and rightfully so, and I think that's as good as any of the modern triggers. And then you have the magazine assembly. So you can see they've done everything possible to reduce cost. I mean, I've seen some prototypes where they, not for a Ruger, but for another manufacturer where this is no longer steel, because the only piece that really needs to absorb pressure is the lugs. That from here back to here can be a polymer, and we know from Glocks and other firearms that polymers are pretty strong. That would make the bolt a lot lighter. So you'd basically be turning a polymer tube with a striker inside and a spring. I haven't seen that on the market yet. And I forgot to mention, there's some recoil involved with the Bushmaster round. So they put this muzzle brake, which was quite effective. Actually, I didn't notice any significant recoil. So in terms of practicality and modern function, the American is totally acceptable rifle. Which rifle is the better rifle? Well, the 77. I mean, I think it's one of my favorite expressions. I think it's self-evident that this rifle is comprised of what one would ordinarily expect in a rifle. And I'm sure these stocks are cheap. I don't know what happens if you fall and break your trigger guard, or what happens. I guess you throw another stock on, and who knows what that costs the manufacturer. Probably not much. This has to be checkered either by machine or by hand or by laser. So a whole bunch of different things have to go into firearms. This is a good trigger, very simple, and I generally look at things in terms of their simplicity, and the Ruger trigger is simple. And then this came in that 35 Whelen caliber, which I like. Floor plate, this is steel. I checked with a magnet. It's got some kind of laser or whatever etching. Ruger looks all right. Doesn't really need to be there. One thing Ruger's always done is they, instead of having the screw that holds the action to the recoil lug going straight like the Mauser, they've always done it at an angle. And the theory is that you're pulling the stock this way tight as opposed to just this way. I don't know whether it makes all that much difference, but it's one of the things that they at the beginning said was a big deal. Typical safety here, and then the Ruger American has the Tang safety. So in conclusion, the American is obviously a very simplified rifle, but they all seem to be very simplified these days. And then there's a school of shooters that's willing to pay more. I'm probably one of them. I try these just to keep up to date. But which is a proper rifle? Well, the Model 77. But who knows? Maybe they're even going to stop making them one of these days. Oh, and I have on the table this excellent book. I like reading. So I picked this up for whatever. Very good book. It covers everything that you need to know about Ruger. Bill Ruger, extraordinary entrepreneur and sort of a gun genius of his own. And he liked these investment castings, which is a way to get away from milling and other expensive gun operations. So I hope that covers the 77 and most of your questions and comments. And another reader asked me, where does it sit in the hierarchy of bolt-action rifles? So we've got the Ruger 77, Winchester Model 70, Remington Model 700, and then a whole bunch of others. And I would say probably the Winchester Model 70 is number one. I've said that before. Remington 700 is hard to get around, and then probably the Ruger, although sometimes I think it should be second. But there's a whole family of, say, Remington 700 clones, like even the Tikka arguably is sort of like the Remington 700 and many others. And what I liked about the Ruger is he tried to make it as close to being a Mauser as he could, without making a Mauser and getting involved in all the expense of a Mauser action. And that remains true to this day. And I guess people must be willing to pay because they keep making them, and hopefully will for a long time to come. So that's about it. A lot of talk about the Ruger 77 and the Ruger American, but great rifles. And try that Bushmaster. It's something. And again, we should talk more about these 3-lug bolts. This is not as new as people think. I've seen those a long time ago, but it seems to be theme these days. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching.